Liz Regman with us here today. Thanks, Liz. We're really looking forward to this presentation.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you all for joining in. I am excited to share my learnings, both formal and through experience on hiring, recruitment, and selection for individuals like yourselves who are nonprofit managers. So why don't we get started with why me talking about this and why you in terms of why you're on this webinar. I'm sure that everyone has participated in hiring a person, and so they have probably a really basic idea of the format. You post a job, you review the resumes, you conduct some interviews, and then you ask some questions that are related to the job. You listen, you make a decision, and then you really hope for the best. And it is sometimes an easy process, and sometimes it can be a challenging process when you're not able to hire or find the right candidate. It is something that every manager is expected to do if they have direct reports, and it is something that every manager is going to encounter doing, but not necessarily doing it often. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so challenging. It's something you're expected to do and to know, but you don't necessarily practice it on a consistent basis because, hopefully you don't have, such high turnover that you're conducting recruitment and selection every month. And so for me personally, what ended up happening is after I conducted one particular interview, probably around 3 years ago, I was really kind of left at the end of it wondering, am I doing this in a way that's in the best interest of the organization in terms of finding the right candidate? And is it in the best interest of the candidate? Am I being impartial? And am I being objective? Am I asking the right questions? Am I making the right choice? And it was at that point that I realized that I don't actually have a lot of practice in this hiring task. And so I went to my manager because I also knew that this wasn't going to be the last interview that I conducted, that there was going to be more. I work in the nonprofit sector, I work in fundraising, and so as we all know, there is an unfortunately high turnover rate in the fundraising world. Every 2 years, on average, individuals leave and go on to another organization and another role. Sometimes they leave sooner, sometimes, they stay a little bit longer, but that's kind of the average. And so I knew that that interview that I had completed wasn't going to be my last, and it certainly hasn't been my last one. And so I knew that I needed some formal training on this. And I knew that if I was going to feel confident in my abilities, I needed some of that formal learning and some more practice. And so I actually enlisted in the professional certificate program in human resources at George Brown College. And I asked my supervisor, the VP of development here at Pathways to Education Canada, to allow me to participate in every interview that the fundraising team was part of, and that I always put up my hand to be part of the interview process for other teams at Pathways to assist them with their recruitment as well, so that I could continue to get more of that practice. So this webinar and what I'm going to be talking about is really related to that learned experience that I have, the formal training, along with what I learned sort of doing the work. So what are you going to learn? What am I going to share with you? I'm hoping that you'll come away with the importance of the prep work that's required before you even think about posting a job or even before you book any sort of interview, and how that prep work is going to help you through the entire process to make it that much easier to post the job, to figure out who to interview, to figure out how to make a decision, how to come up with great interview questions, how to determine how you would articulate what the role and its expectations are. And I'm going to hopefully respectfully challenge you and invite you to think about whether your criteria and requirements are fair, objective, and not biased. And so how do we ensure that we have a good diversity of candidates, and that the interview process, the recruitment process, the requirements aren't inadvertently or unintentionally eliminating candidates that may be great for the role. This particular process, it's a 5-step process. I like things that are like easy to remember, so 5 steps we're going to go through. And after each step, I'm going to pause, and if there are any questions related to that particular step, like in a good interview, you always want your candidates to ask great questions, but you don't want them to ask too many questions. So Marina is going to actually comb through the top question related to that step, post it, we'll answer it. If we don't get to your question, we'll make sure we get to them at the end. And speaking of questions, one of the things we're also going to talk about is, some good questions to ask, and how to frame some of the interview questions so that you're really kind of digging in and getting to understand the candidate. Who are they, and do they really want this role that you've posted? Are they the right person for the role? Do they have the knowledge, experience, and skills to get the job done and do it really well? And again, to really think about how to do that in a very fair, objective, not objectable. We don't want any objectable interviews. Objective and as free from bias as possible kind of interview recruitment process. So what's the first step? If anyone has watched The Sound of Music, they will recognize this. Let's start at the very beginning. And so when you start at the very beginning of your recruitment and selection process, you're starting with what is known as a job analysis. So maybe you have a new role that you're creating and that you want to fill, or maybe you have an existing role that a person has recently left and you need to find a great candidate and a great person to fill that role. Before you even can begin to think about a job posting or an interview, you want to stop and reflect on that role. And you want to conduct either a thorough job analysis or perhaps a refresh of an existing job analysis. So what is a job analysis? What do I mean when I say about a job analysis? What it is a comprehensive sort of look at the role in the job. It's looking at what are all the duties, responsibilities, and accountabilities. It's about what kind of knowledge, skills, and experience are required in order to, be successful in the role. It's looking at competencies, and competencies, you want to think about those as soft skills, things like adaptability, creativity, resilience, the ability to deal with stressful situations, because there's never a stressful situation in a nonprofit, right? And you want to think about educational requirements. Are they necessary? Are they not necessary? Salary. What's the career path for this role? Like, is this a role where there is no career path, there is no natural progression, or what is that trajectory within the organization? And looking also at reporting structure. Oftentimes when we're thinking about hiring someone, the question will come up, what are you looking for? And oftentimes the answer to that is like someone who can do the job well. And the thing is, you really need to define what does that mean to do the job well. You need to be able to articulate that. What are the characteristics? What are the traits? What are the values, the competencies that make that up? What does doing the job well mean? You also want to consider what is a necessity and what is a nice to have. So again, we know that not everyone is going to have every single skill, every single competency that you are looking for in this role. So which ones are the ones that if this person does not have them, they will not be able to do the job well? What are the ones that are like, you know what, it would be great if they had these, but if they don't, I can probably teach them, or they could probably learn it on the job. I'm willing to tolerate some level of a learning curve. And what are the ones where it's like, I cannot tolerate a learning curve. I need them to hit the ground running and do what they need to do. And so it's in this job analysis that you really want to be thinking about those things, going from, you know, very broad to narrowing it down to what is the essential and the core components that a person needs to possess in order to do the job well and be successful in it. What you want to think about as well is like, what are the pieces that you're willing to train someone on? So again, that idea that, you know, not everyone is going to have every single knowledge, skill, and experience. So what are you willing to train, and what are you not willing to train on? What do you not have the time, the energy, or the patience, or the capacity, or the resources to train them on? Or what do you do have them, that capacity and resources to train them on? So I'll give you an example. You know, we at Pathways, we often hire development coordinators here. They're more junior roles. They're usually great for people who are just entering the fundraising profession, looking to get a sort of broad level of experience in different areas of fundraising. So for us, we are more concerned, our necessity is that they have the great competencies required for the role, and we are willing to teach them fundraising 101. So we're willing to invest in sending them off to maybe a Charity Village webinar, perhaps an AFP in-person fundraising course, have them invest time and effort into reading articles or, you know, fundraising books in order to learn. We're okay with that part, but we're like, you know what, they need to have these competencies around adaptability, resilience, ability to deal, you know, with situations that sort of pop up in a moment and be able to react with sort of grace under pressure. So those are the kinds of things that you want to be considering at this moment in time before you even start looking at any candidate who might fill the role. You also want to think about, what does it mean to be successful in this role? And really kind of drilling down into that, and what is that going to look like? Especially during those crucial first 3 months. You know, that is technically a person's probationary period. You've gone to a lot of trouble and time and effort to post a job, interview them, hire them. You know, obviously you don't want to then turn around and let go of a candidate, but you do still have that buffer of 3 months to kind of like test drive how the relationship and how, you know, they as a employee in your organization, how they're going to work out. So how are you going to measure that? How are you going to be able to define they were successful in the first 3 months or they were not successful in the first 3 months? So you have to, in this moment in time, be really clear about how are you defining and measuring that success. I'll give you an example. We hired a development coordinator recently, great individual, and one of their measures of success, because one of their key projects was processing thank you letters and generating tax receipts. And so the expectation that was set for them was that they needed to know how to, you know, generate those thank you letters and tax receipts, know what the schedule is, complete the task with minimal errors, on time, and also then start to think about and look at and understand maybe some of the nuances around that, and you know, potentially suggest some process improvements. That would be the expectation that is set, so that at the end of the 3 months you can measure, did they meet that, did they accomplish it? And then for them, it's a great guidepost. They know this is the thing I need to learn and get really good at in order to be successful in this role, in order to keep, you know, my position here in the organization. So this is the time when you want to be thinking about that. What is that probationary period measurement of how you're going to define whether this was the right choice in terms of a candidate and whether they continue on or whether you part ways at that 3 month end of probationary period. Oftentimes, one of the questions we ask candidates in interviews is like, what would you do in the first 30, 60, and 90 days? Can you answer that question? And this is the time and place to be thinking about what do you expect them to do in the first 30, 60, and 90 days? Again, from two perspectives. One is, if you are able to answer that question, then you will be able to know when you hear the answer from a candidate, whether that's an appropriate answer or not. Secondly, it also helps you to really clarify. So when a candidate or a successful applicant starts in the role, you'll be able to allow them to tell them what are their expectations, what are they going to be they need to do, and what they need to accomplish and what they need to learn. And so you're going to give them a lot of clarity around that. Because I think one of the biggest challenges when hiring staff and where there is a disconnect is oftentimes candidates will say, you know, what was stated to me wasn't exactly what ended up transpiring, or I expected or I assumed it would be this based on, say, a job posting, and it turned out to be something different. So you really want to gain some clarity around those expectations. What are the competencies, the knowledge, the skills, the experiences? What are the duties and responsibilities and accountabilities of this role at this moment in time before you even post the job? You want to be clear on the salary, and you want to be clear on the career path, because I can tell you those are going to be the top two questions the candidates are going to be asking you. You know, what's the career path? What's my career opportunities in my role? Especially if you have younger or those who are new to the profession, who are just starting out, they're going to want to understand, you know, where their career fits in or doesn't fit in with the organization. And when you think about defining all of these components, it will be much easier for you to develop interview questions. It'll be easier for you to come up with, how do I score whether the person answered the questions appropriately or not. And it will really help you understand what you are looking for in order to know that when you see it, you found it. Because if you don't know what you're looking for, how are you going to know it's in front of you at that moment in time? Alrighty, so we're at the end of step number 1. Marina, was there any questions?
We don't have any burning questions from that section, Liz. I think you covered it off really well. So I think we can keep going. But just a reminder, if you do have questions for Liz, pop them in the question box as we're going forward. Oh, we did have a question about reporting structure, Liz. Could you explain maybe a little bit about that and what you mean by that?
Sure. So reporting structure is really around who do they report into and who reports into them. Again, so do they have anyone that they're going to be supervising? Who is supervising them? Who is going to be determining their performance and sort of assessing their performance? That's what I mean around reporting structure, because there can be, you know, depending on the role, you could end up having 2 individuals being your supervisor. And so what does that, if that's the case, like what does that structure look like? What percentage? What does it mean in terms of what do you report into whom? Or it may be just a one-to-one. It's just, again, around being really clear around that piece.
Wonderful. Thanks, Liz.
Great. So you've done all of that work. You've had a lot of thought. You've done a lot of reflection. You've done a lot of writing down a lot of details. You know, you've looked at the role from every single angle. You've really kind of drilled into what do I need, what competencies I'm looking for, how is this, who's going to be the right person for this role, really understanding all of that. So once all of that has been done, you can finally come up with putting together a job posting. And you really want to think of a job posting as a marketing tool. It is not a laundry list of every single job duty, every single requirement. One of the things that I see a lot, particularly in nonprofit job postings, is like 20 bullet points on requirements, 20 bullet points on duties and responsibilities. And I get it, you want to be very transparent on what are the duties and responsibilities, what you want out of the candidate. That's a lot. And I think, you know, one of the other things I've seen is that there's been very, very little comment on what's in it for the applicant. What is the benefits? Literally, what are the benefits? What's the total compensation package look like? What is the enticement to want to work at your organization? Why do they want to work for you? Why do they want to work in this role? I don't see a lot of that, and I would suggest actually flipping that. So one of the things we do at Pathways when we do a fundraising job posting is the first thing we talk about is at a very high level, you know, what kind of role is it and what we're seeking in 2 sentences. And then the first thing we talk about is like, what's in it for you? What do we offer? And then we talk a little bit about like, what would you do? And then what the expectations around what you bring as a candidate for the role. Here's an example of this very quickly in terms of where we really highlight competencies in that sort of couple of first sentences to give people a sense and a flavor of the type of individual that we're looking for. So we're trying to be really transparent, but we're also trying to do it in a very sort of simple language way, and we're trying to do it in such a way that they have a clear understanding of what would be expected of them in that role. So, you know, 2 sentences we've used is like, we seek a curious, process-driven, proactive fundraising professional. So there's our 3 competencies that we're looking for. Who's motivated by updating the donor database as much as they are with connecting and engaging potential supporters. So again, we've indicated, we're very transparent, this is a bit of a hybrid role, a little bit of data entry, so behind a computer, a little bit of frontline fundraising. It's an ideal position for an individual interested in taking their first step into frontline fundraising, while leveraging their administrative and project coordination skills. So again, we're probably providing a little bit of a hint. We're not looking for someone who has a lot of experience in fundraising. We're probably looking for someone who has a bit more experience in the administrative, sort of that database management side of things. But here's an opportunity to learn the frontline fundraising pieces of it. So again, you want to think about the job posting as a marketing tool. You want to think about it as it's a competitive job market out there, so you want to really think about not so much of what do I need, but like what is the enticement, what is going to pique someone's interest to take the time and effort to submit a resume and a cover letter and apply for your role. You want to think about, remember, those top competencies and top knowledge, skills, and experience. Those are the ones that you want to highlight. And here's where you want to be really careful about what you're including and how essential it is for a particular role. And I'll give you 2 examples. An interesting fact that I had heard recently was that when you indicate the number of years of experience that are required, women will take that very literally, and if they don't have those number of years of experience, they don't apply. Whereas men, you know, they're so confident they will apply regardless of whether they have those number of years of experience or not. So you really want to think about, like, is it absolutely necessary to put in a definitive number of years of experience? Maybe if it's a director role, maybe if it's a senior CEO team member, then yes, maybe that is essential. But if it's a development officer, a coordinator role, maybe mid-career or entry level, does it matter if they have 2 years or 3 years? How essential is that? If the depth of knowledge they have in the 2 years equivalent to someone's less than depth of knowledge within 4 years? Does 4 years versus 5 years make that much of a difference? So you really want to think about that. Again, at Pathways, we have actually decided not to indicate, particularly in our coordinator and officer roles on the fundraising team, how many years of experience we need. And so what's interesting is we sometimes find we have people applying for coordinator roles who have 5 years of experience. And you think, oh, well, they're overqualified, I'm going to eliminate them. Well, no, maybe they're 5 years of contract experience and they're actually looking for a place where they can stay and grow and learn something new within fundraising, and their 5 years of experience is transferable, but they're looking for a different angle of fundraising. So if you had indicated, I'm only looking for someone with 1 to 2 years of experience, are you now eliminating that individual potentially? That would have been an amazing, awesome candidate. The other one that I comment on is around education. Again, you know, there are some rules, accountants, medical directors, social workers. Yes, formal training, education, absolutely essential to the role. Administrative assistant. Does an administrative assistant need a university degree to answer the phone and provide exceptional customer service? Are you eliminating great candidates by putting that in as a requirement? So again, I would invite you to think about some of those requirements and whether that's one of those like, well, we've always done that, so that's what we always do, or, and oh, it's like part of our just, you know, job description, job band, or is it really required in the job posting, and are you potentially eliminating great candidates with those requirements? So again, really think about what are the requirements that are very directly related to being able to perform the role, and really think about at a very high level, what are the duties and responsibilities, again, so that the candidate can kind of focus in and highlight their strengths and their experiences in relation to your top needs. The other thing I would talk about, I wanted to highlight, is around salary transparency. I know that when I first started out in my career many years ago, you never talked about salary. You never asked about salary. That was taboo. That was a way to ensure that you would not move forward in the recruitment and selection process, was if you were to ask what the salary is. That was many years ago. I think today is very different. There are many compelling reasons why you would want to include and post your salary in your job posting. Again, there have been studies done that have indicated that by not being transparent in your salaries, you are creating situations where people of color may not apply, or they may indicate a salary that is below what the fair market value is of the role. And so you're kind of placing them in a difficult situation. I think as well, you know, especially if you're a small nonprofit and you have a hard reality around how much you can pay, it is far better to be transparent about that at the very beginning than to go through an entire interview process, offer a person a job, and then for them to say, oh, that's like, I can't live off of that, I can't accept the job. And then you have gone through an entire process and wasted a lot of time and effort and have to start it all over again. So those would be reasons why I would advocate for salary transparency. I know this is it's an organizational decision, and so some organizations are very transparent and some are not necessarily comfortable with that. Again, is one of those things I would invite you to think about why you don't do it, and how it may actually help you and help in terms of diversifying your pool of candidates in terms of posting that salary. Alrighty, that was the end of step 2. Marina, was there any questions on the job posting section?
Yes, there are a couple I'd like to cover. So first of all, Carrie is asking, what if you also stated on that job posting that you may consider alternative combinations of education and experience?
That I think that's a good way to work around that. Again, I would kind of, it's one of those things, I think you have to explicitly think about it and then be comfortable with how you proceed. So my advice is, so long as you are challenging whether this is in fact what you need as it's related to the role, or as you said, it was Carrie, I'm terrible with names, stated that that was an option, I think that's also equally acceptable. But again, it's around being mindful of what it is that you need that's related to the role in order for the person to be successful in the role.
Excellent. And the other question I'd like to address, just because I think it's a really important one and there are some rules around this. How do you feel, Liz, about asking candidates for salary expectations?
So that's an interesting question because it is one of the things we do here at Pathways, and I have had an interesting experience with it. So one of the things is we have usually in our phone screening interviews, which is sort of the first step after the resume review, we've asked candidates around their salary expectations. And let's be frank, no candidate is going to ask for a salary that is at the bottom of a salary band. You know, if they have done their research around what is the fair market value, or what's the market saying in terms of this particular role and this size of organization, what the range is, and the range is, you know, for argument's sake, between 50 and 60,000. What candidate is going to say, I'll work for 50,000? They're all going to say 60. They're always going to put their best foot forward. They're always going to want what's, you know, the highest amount. Why wouldn't you, right? And so it becomes, you know, what ends up happening is sometimes you'll say, oh, they're outside of the salary band, I'm not going to move forward with the interview. Meanwhile, you know, salary in that instance, you're not allowing them the opportunity to negotiate. Or again, you've asked them to put their best foot forward and now you're penalizing them because, oh, their expectation is outside the range. So one of the things I have done to work around that is I will ask for salary expectation. If the person is outside of the range, but they're a great candidate, I will give them the choice. I'll come back to them and I'll say, you know what, you were a great candidate. I would really love to move forward with an in-person interview. However, I want to be clear, your expectations are outside of our salary band. And so with that in mind, if you want to continue to move forward with the discussion, I would love to have you. If you don't, and I understand that, if you're like very, you know, this is like a hard line around salary, then, you know, thank you so much for your time. And what's interesting is I've had a lot of candidates come back and say to me, no, that's great. I want to continue moving forward with the interview process. So it was clear they were saying, again, a number because they want to, what's in their best personal interest from a financial perspective, which I think is, you know, we all should be doing that. We all should be thinking about that. So that's, you know, one caveat to that I would be, you could be conceivably eliminating a candidate based on a piece of data or criteria that may or may not be relevant if you prod them further.
Excellent. Thanks, Liz. I think we can move forward.
Keep moving forward. All right. I'm sorry. Job posting. There we go. I went backwards instead of forwards. We want to go forward. So I suspect that many nonprofits don't have an automated screening tool for resumes, and you're probably reviewing resumes manually. That's certainly the case where I work here at Pathways to Education at the moment. And it can be really challenging when you have hundreds of resumes to wade through. So again, you need to really be clear about what are you going to be looking for and how are you going to find it on the resume. And also thinking about how are you going to be objective and free from bias when you're using the content within the resume and making sure that what you're looking at can be replicated with each resume review. And so you want to think about some of those easy and obvious data points that you would typically find on most resumes that, you know, the majority of people would include. Again, that could be around education, years of experience, previous employers. One thing I would comment on is, if you're looking for a frontline fundraiser, then how the resume looks isn't going to be a fair judgment or a fair assessment of whether you move them forward in an interview or not. If the role is for a graphic designer and it's around their design skills and their creativity, then yes, maybe how the aesthetic of the resume is maybe a data point that you want to be looking at. And so one of the things you might want to do, one of the things I would advocate to do is really think about, some 3 or 4 data points that you can easily, when you're scanning a resume, look for, see if you can find, and then indicate whether yes, no, the person has them, in order to then be able to segment the pile into a yes or no pile in terms of moving forward with an interview. And so this is an example of just a very simple scoring rubric. Again, you can weight the scores. So in other words, you can say, grant writing experience is like really, really critical. So I'm going to score that much higher than if they have an MBA. And so you can assign different point values to each of these, or you can just do a straight 1-to-1. Like if they have all 4 of these data points, they get 4 out of 4. You can score it on if they don't, then that's a 0, or maybe it's a 1 if they meet the minimum, or maybe if it's a 2 because they've have more than one of these data points that articulates that they have that knowledge, skill, or experience. And then from there, the ones with the top scores would be the ones that would probably move forward in the interview process. And would you have like a form for every single resume? Again, if it's 100 resumes, probably not. But this can be like a very easy way to be like, yes, no, and then from the yeses, maybe dig a little deeper. This is really, really critical to think about, again, what are the essential knowledge, skills, and experiences, because those are the things that you can probably, through a data point on a resume, glean, whereas you wouldn't be able to figure out if they have the competencies. That would probably be something that comes out in an interview when you're reviewing. And you really want to be clear about what these knowledge, skills, and experiences are in advance. I had, when I took my recruitment and selection course, the instructor was commenting on a situation where she was helping an individual hire for a project manager, and they had 400 resumes. It's a lot to go through. And so, the person that was looking for the project manager had mentioned one particular piece of data point. So they went through it. They were only able to cull 200 resumes, and they still had 200 resumes to go. And so the hiring manager was like, oh, right, and here's another data point that actually we shouldn't be looking at. And meanwhile, if you had all of those data points to begin with, they probably would have been much faster in their resume review in order to then get to the interview process. So again, it's something, you would want to look at this during the job analysis part, that preparatory work. What are the essentials? What are the data points in a resume that will get them from resume submitted to having a conversation? We're up to step 4. Marina, was there any questions regarding the resume review?
No, I think we're good to move forward, Liz. Just watching the time here. Yeah.
Yes, I know. I will try and speed up my talking. So we're getting to the fun part, right? Like, we've done all of this preparatory work. We've done all this reading and thinking and reflecting. And now it's around having a conversation with the potential candidates. When I think about interviews, I always now conduct a phone screening interview. And I usually, when I do that resume review, I try and come up with the top 10 candidates that I would conduct a phone screening interview with. I may, and I look at having a phone screening interview to be a maximum of 30 minutes. So why do I do that? Well, I do that because I have found through experience that when I don't do the phone screening interview and I go straight into the first person interview, inevitably I end up spending several hours, both of my time, the candidate's time to come down. I always have someone else in the interview, so it's their time. We go through all of that, and then we realize, you know what? None of these candidates were the right fit, or something has gone somehow slightly awry, and this isn't the right ratio or the right pool of candidates to what we're looking for. And so the phone screening interview, it means that it's, you know, you can do double the number of interviews with individuals, because if it's a maximum of 30 minutes, you can talk to 2 people instead of just 1 person in an hour. And you're doing it from the comfort of your telephone booth, or, you know, from working from home. That other person isn't traveling in, and so you're kind of saving a little bit of time. And usually what I like to do after I have done the phone screening is I like to narrow it down to 4 people that I would invite in for an in-person interview. And then from that first interview, I would narrow it down to 2 people for the second interview. During this process, you also want to think about what kind of tests would you be having individuals participate in. You know, maybe it's an Excel test in detail, so you have them doing a proofreading test. Maybe writing is a significant component of the role, so maybe you have them do a writing sample. If French language is an essential part of the role, how are you going to test their ability and their level of skill in French? So those are the kinds of things that you would want to think about as part of this whole interview process. With a phone screening, I always want to make sure that I introduce myself. I want to be very clear about the role. Again, I want to be clear about what are the expectations, what am I looking for, what are the duties and responsibilities, so that they and also sort of realigning those to the questions that I'm asking in my interview process. And I want to be clear about that, again, because we want to be setting those expectations before the person has even been hired, so that when they're going through this, at the end of it, they can say with confidence, I know what the expectations are of me as a candidate or a successful applicant in this role. I know what I'm going to need to be doing. I know what will be the duties and responsibilities. So there needs to be real clarity around that. In the phone screening interview, I usually ask 1 question per skill. I usually pick about 3 skills that I want to be thinking about and highlighting. And I try and ask 1 question related to competency. I give the candidates an opportunity to ask questions, and I always articulate next steps. So again, back to that step 1 in terms of planning, I think about how long is it going to take me to get through the phone screening interviews? When will I be holding the first set of interviews? What is, you know, happening in the organization? Who else do I need to talk to? What does their time look like? So that when a candidate asks like what the next steps are, I can say to them, we will complete phone screening interviews in the next 3 days. You will be notified, you know, the next following Tuesday about whether you are moving forward in the process or not. And you will hear from me by email. And then I will also speak about what's the time frame around the in-person interviews. You know, I will say, if you are the successful candidate, you will expected to be coming in for an in-person interview on the Thursday and Friday when we book those. Details will be in the communication, you know, on the Tuesday, as I mentioned. And that clarity is important for 2 reasons. One is, more than likely, candidates are applying for other jobs. And so if they have an understanding that if they don't hear from you within the very next day, that doesn't mean that they've been eliminated. It just means that they know what the time frame is. The second thing is, it really speaks to your organization and how seriously you take this role, how seriously you take this process, and then what can they potentially expect when they're working for the organization in terms of the type of communication and clarity that you're going to be providing, or that will be expected of them in the role. So those are all really incredibly important things to consider. The unfortunate reality in recruitment and selection is that ghosting is a hard reality where candidates will ghost potential employers. And there is a lot of critique and commentary on how employers go silent, don't follow up, and how that leaves a really negative impression of the organization. And so I think the very least that we can do in this entire process is be courteous and respectful of everyone's time, our own and those of the candidates. This, you'll see, is a screen with a lot of words on it. Again, this is just a very simple scoring rubric for the phone interviews. So on the first column is what's the competency or the skill that I'm looking for, what's the question, and then being really, really clear about what is an adequate or inadequate answer, what is an exceptional answer as opposed to an answer that meets the standard. And from this will help you guide you again on who would move forward in an in-person interview. When we come to the actual in-person interviews, one of the things I've highlighted here in orange is step 1 and step 4. Again, I think these are things where we focus so much on what are the great interview questions, who's going to ask which interview questions, what's the time, what's the room, that we don't think about what are we going to say about ourselves, what are we going to say about the role. And I've been guilty of this. And what the problem is with that is if you say one thing to one candidate about who you are and what the role is, and you say something slightly different to another candidate, you're not being fair and you're not being consistent. And so in other words, you're sharing different pieces of information with different candidates. And so you're giving them different perspective, which will affect the objectivity and the fairness of the interview process. So I would actually encourage you to write out your introduction of who you are and what you want to say and what you want to convey, and the same with the role and the expectations. And yes, the duties and responsibilities and the requirements of the role will be in the job posting. You will have talked about it in the phone screening interview. Yes, talk about it here again. It's incredibly important. I read an interesting story of an individual. There was multiple job postings at an organization. They had applied for one particular job. They came in for an interview. They were interviewing with a person. They assumed they were interviewing for the role they applied for. The HR person, not realizing it, thought they were interviewing a person for another role. And so at the end, they were like, you don't have any of the requirements for this, role, blah, blah, blah. And the person's like, yeah, but I didn't apply for blah, blah, blah. I applied for something else. And so again, you spent an hour having a conversation about a role that the person hadn't applied for. And so again, you want to be really crystal clear, what's the role, and remind them, this is the role that you're applying for. This is the conversation we're having about this role and your potential to be a successful candidate in this role. You want to think about asking structured interview questions. So what does that mean? A structured interview means you ask this, very specific questions and the same questions to the same candidates. So the unstructured would be like, hey, how's it going? What do you think about this role? Why are you the best candidate? Okay, let me look at your resume. Let me ask you about this, right? Where you haven't thought about what you want to ask them. And again, that means that you are gleaning different pieces of information from different candidates. So you're not able to compare each candidate equally based on the data that they're providing or the information they're providing. So that's why it's really important, so that it is fair and objective for each candidate to ask them the exact same questions in the same order. The reality is that you are going to end up asking them questions for clarification on a resume. You're probably going to ask them maybe a follow-up question related to something that they said. That is a reality. There's often times where I will feel like I'm not really understanding the person, and I want to get to know the person to understand if they're the right fit for the role. And I will sometimes ask them, other questions above and beyond those ones that I prepared in order to understand that. That's a reality, but at the very minimum, you should have those structured interview questions, again, related very specifically to the duty, the experience, their skills, their knowledge, and the competencies that you're seeking. You want to make sure that the candidates have an opportunity to ask questions, and then you want to articulate those next steps, as I've mentioned before, why the importance of why that is. With the interview questions, you want to ask one question at a time. Again, think about the interviewee. They're nervous. They want to make a great impression. You start asking them 4 or 5 questions, they're going to get lost. And they're going to be like, I can't remember what question number 1 was. I will remember the one that was most recently stated to me. And they may actually blank. And they may give you a muddled answer because you may be asking multiple things all at once. So really focus in on asking one question at a time. Keep the questions short. Again, really long-winded questions, people are going to get lost in the details, so try and really keep them short. It can be hard because if you're asking situational questions, you're probably going to set up a situation, and so then that, can get a little bit more lengthy. But one of the things I have found is people ask a question and then they proceed to elaborate on it, and then repeat it in a different way. And sometimes it's just about ask the question, shut up, and listen to what they have to say. Because the idea is you want to listen more and talk less, because you want to get to know the person that is across from you, and so you want to hear what they have to say. And so you want to give them as much time as possible to speak and be able to answer intelligently the questions that you ask. You want to thank the candidates for the response. So one of the things that I always do to, again, kind of signal to the candidate, I've heard you, we're going to move on to the next question, is I always thank them. So I'll ask the question, they'll respond, I'll make sure that point of providing eye contact, I'll try and look like through my body language that I'm listening. I might sort of lean in, I might make eye contact, really kind of try and keep eye contact, nod to, demonstrate that I'm listening, I hear what they have to say. And then oftentimes at the end, I'll be like, great, thank you for that answer. And then I can continue to move on so that they know it's a nice way to kind of transition. And then again, be sort of respectful of the time and effort they've put in to answer the question. These are some examples of questions. Hopefully everyone will have a copy of the slide deck. You can sort of take a look at these. The one thing I will comment on is you want to avoid yes, no questions because that doesn't glean any insight. The one question I will highlight here on the bottom is this one called, what question do you have for me? As opposed to, do you have any questions? So, do you have any questions is a yes, no, and it kind of signals inadvertently, subconsciously, this meeting is over, this interview is over, and I'm going to assume you have none, and we're going to finish off. Versus, what questions do you have for me? Is assuming or acknowledging, I know you're going to have questions, so let me hear them. You want to think a lot about, again, behavioral or situational questions. So behavioral ones are, tell me about a time when you did this, when you had that kind of experience, when you dealt with a difficult client, when you had to, provide, difficult decision or, bad news, whatever the case might be. The other piece I would highlight is really thinking about, again, to give the interviewee some boundaries around how much information. Think about, tell me the top 3 things. What 3 attributes, what 3 qualities. So they know I just need to come up with 3, not 10 or not 1. And 3s, usually people can remember, it's easy to kind of think about. So those are pieces that I would definitely focus in on. Always think about looking at values, the organizational values, the individual's values. Is there alignment there? And that will help you understand if the candidate is the right fit for the organization. All right, these are also some great questions. I'm going to keep moving forward onto the decision. I'm not going to ask Marina if there's any questions. We've talked a lot about questions, and I know that we are very short on time because I get very enthusiastic and like to talk a lot. So thank you all so far to getting up to step number 5, which is your decision, which really, it should be quite easy at this point because you've done a lot of work around defining and understanding and gaining clarity around what you're looking for, how the person's going to be successful, what does it mean that they're going to have, you know, a good fit for them and the role. At this point in time, you're going to want to look at both the scoring and then you're also going to look at your own intuition. And your intuition should be strong and solid because you've done a lot of that prep work to really look at, analyze, write out, think about, reflect on the role and what's needed for it. And you want to think about, you know, where does diversity and inclusion considerations come into play? So does your organization have any diversity and inclusions policies? Is there some sort of scoring or weighting that you're going to attribute that would affect, you know, whether a candidate is decided upon or not? You'll want to look at references. Again, that's incredibly important. Don't not do them. The one thing you want to be concerned about is backdoor references. This is a little tricky. It's a reality, but it is something that you need to be careful with. A backdoor reference is a reference where you know a mutual colleague and you contact that colleague and you say, hey, can you tell me a little bit about Marina? And, you know, meanwhile, Marina doesn't know that you know that person that you're asking about them. So you may be jeopardizing their privacy. You may be inadvertently sharing something that Marina doesn't want, you know, everyone to know. And it also will color and bias your decision. And it's not fair or objective to the individual because they haven't been able to have an ability to participate in that part of it. That's my whirlwind around decisions. Really, decisions at this point, it should be easy because you've done all of the heavy lifting up until this point. Again, you want to think about all of the different components and then think about how you're going to weight them in order to make your decision. So my final thoughts are from start to finish. This should take about 2 months at the very least. It probably will take longer. And that's if you're super organized. And most of your time is going to be spent at the front end and knowing that you need to be really clear about the requirements of the role, the competencies, what are you assessing, how are you assessing that, and if you follow these stages, hopefully your recruitment and selection efforts would be consistent, objective, replicable, and relatively easy to be done with confidence. That is all for me. Thank you all so much for listening in. And if you have any questions at all, my contact information is available. Please reach out. Marina, over to you to finish things off in the last more than 10 seconds.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Liz. So for those of you that are jumping off now because we're on the hour, we are going to take a few more questions because Liz is going to hang around for a little bit here, but we are recording that Q&A. So if you need to go, please go and do what you need to do, and we'll send that recording out later. You can check that out when you have time. So Liz, we had some really great questions coming in that I'd like to address, especially around interviewing. So first of all, do you provide interview questions to candidates in advance?
Good question. I do not, with the exception of I'm just flipping my slides back and forth, with the exceptions of this values question. So I will share with candidates our values in advance so that they have a chance to read them, reflect on them, and then I will say to them, we will be asking you a question regarding these values, so please come prepared. That's about the only question I ask them to prepare for. Other ones, again, you know, one of the things that I really look for in terms of a competency is the ability to react on your feet in difficult situations with calm and grace. So I like to kind of spring things on people and see how they react. And if they can answer it with poise and be articulate, then that to me is a measure of that, whether they fulfill that competency or not. You, as you know, may have a different competency, and so maybe asking, sharing the interview questions in advance, maybe the thing to do. I suspect you're going to get a lot of rehearsed answers versus authentic answers. And so rehearsed answers are tricky because it still doesn't get to who is the person and are they the right person for this role.
That's a great consideration. And sort of on a similar note, Stephanie is asking, how do you feel about objective scoring systems? Stephanie says they've found it a bit difficult knowing how much weight to give to different questions.
It's true. It's not an exact science, and you're right. And I guess that goes back to the part around the job analysis and which of the requirements are more important for you in terms of what the candidate would have in that role. And so that's maybe how you judge what to weigh higher or lower. Again, I would say keep it simple, and it's going to be an iterative process. I think because again, you may go through the interview process and say, well, that didn't kind of work, that weighting wasn't quite right, so then you have to kind of tweak it. But that's how I would kind of approach it. Either do a one-to-one or in advance, having done that job analysis and looking at what are the skills that I need this person to have. I can't train them on, it's core, it's essential, weighting those higher than maybe some of the other ones that you're looking at.
Great. And another one that's come up from a few folks is note-taking during interviews. Yes or no?
I do take notes, and I do allow candidates when they come in, more and more I see candidates with notebooks, and for two different reasons. One is I think they've prepared questions and they've written them down, and so and that demonstrates that they take this seriously and they're coming prepared. I've also seen candidates where they've had to write out the question in order to then think about it and process it. And my thought around that is, on the one hand, I find that a bit distracting, but then on the other hand, you don't eliminate a candidate because of how they think or how they process. And so that would be something, that's a characteristic that you wouldn't want to be scoring on or judging someone on, because that's not fair or objective, and it doesn't relate to the role in the sense of, just because someone has to take a note doesn't mean they can't, that doesn't mean they're going to fail at the job. For me, yes, I do take notes. Of what people say, it's hard sometimes, right? Because they're talking and they may be verbose like I am, or they may be very articulate, or they may just say one word. But it helps to remember what the person has said. The tricky piece of it is, if someone was to come back and say, hey, you didn't hire me, you were biased and unfair, and they filed a formal complaint, those notes would be used as evidence. And so you have to be really careful what you put in the notes to ensure that, again, potentially they or others would have access to them. And then it would be an indication of whether you were in fact objective or biased in your hiring practice. So that's something to keep in consideration.
And moving on to the reference check process. So we've had quite a few questions come in about the backdoor references that you've been addressing, and maybe you could just sort of cover that a little bit again, and the ethics around that, and whether that's permissible.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and I mean, I'm going to be really honest. And this is where it's important to practice and learn about hiring and interviewing and recruiting. In earlier days, I have done backdoor references and thought, this is, super helpful. I'll get a better understanding of who the person really is, whether they're the right fit, understanding, if there's any red flags. And that's a reality. Like, I know that that's what others have probably done that. The challenge with that is, though, the person doesn't know that you are talking about them with other colleagues. And so they, if they're applying for a role, they're obviously trying to present, what are things that are related to how their skills and knowledge and experience aligns with what you need. And so you have to ask the question, is this fair to the candidate? Is this providing bias and looking at information and context that isn't a direct relationship between you and the candidate? If you looked publicly on their LinkedIn profile, that's one thing. Lots of organizations look at people's social media. Again, you have to be really careful around how are you judging their social media with their ability to do this role. And again, are they tweeting something that is in misalignment with the values of your organization or in contradiction to the position that your organization takes? And so therefore, that would be a reason why you wouldn't hire them. Or are you looking at their social media and seeing that, oh, they've got lots of pictures where they're having a good time with their friends, and so that means I'm not going to hire them because, maybe they're too boozy. That's not an objective criteria to determine whether the person should be in the role or not, unless, it's somehow there's a relationship or a direct correlation. So the backdoor references are the ones where the candidate doesn't know that you're talking about them to other people, and you're getting information that is coloring or affecting or influencing your decision. I'm not going to outright say no, you shouldn't do that. From a very high level ethical and potentially legal standpoint, I would strongly discourage it. And I also think about, again, I would invite you and challenge you to think about how fair and unbiased or biased that kind of reference would be. It was a very long-winded answer to the question.
Oh, I think that's helpful, Liz. And I know a few folks have commented in the chat box as well about, with increasing concerns about privacy as well. It's probably just something you should avoid or think very, very carefully before you do it.
I think that's the thing. You have to explicitly think about it and make a very conscious decision, because you'll have to explain the decision if it's questioned. And if you're comfortable explaining the decision, then you should be okay with it. But if you would be uncomfortable, or if it would put the reputation of your organization at risk, then maybe that's something you should reconsider and not do. Like all ethics, it's very gray.
Yes, it's true. I want to end off, Liz, with a great comment, and I think it was from Farah. I have a lot of things here in the chat box. I'm just trying to find it. But just a comment, and it kind of speaks to what you were talking about, Liz, in terms of, treating candidates like they're people, which is just very nicely offering the candidate a glass of water before the interview starts and acknowledging that they're probably going to be talking for an hour maybe, and having a glass of water handy shows that the organization cares. And I think that's a really lovely comment to wrap up on.
For sure. We actually don't even ask them. We just provide it. We have a glass and a pitcher of water, and we assume that they're going to want to drink it. So yeah, those are, there could be a whole session, Marina, on how to treat candidates with great respect and courtesy, because I think there's a lot that can be improved upon that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Liz. It's been a wonderful presentation. We appreciate you hanging around overtime here to answer questions.
No worries.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone else who joined in today. We will follow up with you by email this afternoon or by tomorrow morning with the webinar recording and the slide deck. There will be a short survey there as well that will take less than 5 minutes to fill out. I hope you'll complete that for us if you can. There will be an opportunity there to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see covered in a future session. I know we had a lot of questions about interview practices. Maybe that's something we need to cover. We'll also be sure to share all the feedback with Liz as well. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you for joining us today. We do host dozens of free webinars every year, and I hope that we'll see you at more of our 2020 sessions. Our next free webinar is coming up on March 12th. We're very pleased to welcome World Wildlife Fund Canada's Living Planet at Work program, where they'll be discussing how to create a successful corporate employee engagement program. We will send a link in the email that we send later today in case you'd like to register for that. Thanks again for taking part in today's webinar, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.